From 89.7 WUWM, Milwaukee's NPR, this is Lake Effect. I'm Joy Powers. Today we'll look at local suicide deaths and learn about the work that's being done to prevent them. We'll learn about the victims of the 1886 Bay View Massacre. Then we'll share highlights from Milwaukee Magazine's Best of Milwaukee issue, like who makes the best custard and pizza.
It's kind of the essence of what we do all year round that is boiled into a single feature that kind of celebrates the greatest things that are happening here in Milwaukee.
Plus, we'll talk with a photographer about his book featuring the Great Lakes.
It's really getting at these lakes as a geographic component of the larger American landscape. And it's a place that a lot of folks, frankly, in the United States aren't that familiar with.
All of that is coming up on Lake Effect. This is Lake Effect from 89.7 WUWM, Milwaukee's NPR. I'm Joy Powers, and thank you so much for joining us. Suicide is the 10th leading cause of death in the United States. Young people are the most affected, and a new study finds that suicide rates in Wisconsin have increased over the last decade. Suicide is a critical public health issue, but it can be prevented. There's work being done at the Medical College of Wisconsin to better understand the factors that can lead to suicide and develop ways to prevent it. Dr. Sarah Kolbeck is the director of the Division of Suicide Research and Healing in the Comprehensive Injury Center at the Medical College of Wisconsin. She joins Lake Effect's Audrey Nowakowski to share more.
What we have seen locally in Milwaukee County is that when we look at kind of the makeup of folks who die by suicide, we have seen over the past couple of years increases in younger folks of color and primarily younger Black males dying by suicide in our community. Whereas, for example, the proportion of, middle-aged white males is decreasing, which is obviously great news, but then we're seeing this increase in younger folks in our community. And so some of the research that we're doing is focusing on things like, better understanding how to identify folks who are at risk for suicide a bit earlier so that they are able to be, navigated to the appropriate treatment that they need to kind of prevent them from getting to that crisis point in the first place. We're also, thinking a little bit broader and thinking about some of the kind of structural and community level factors that contribute to suicide and suicidal behavior in our community. We talk a lot about, racism and structural discrimination. We talk about things like housing and other kind of social determinants of health and basic needs that, we find are contributing stressors to a number of the suicides that we see.
With all these contributing stressors that impact suicide rates, especially amongst different populations, such as young Black men, like you said, what are some key suicide prevention strategies you're looking into?
Yeah, that's a great question. So my background is in public health, and so I tend to think upstream. And when we're talking about, these social determinants of health, these really upstream factors, a lot of times prevention lies in policy and systems change. And so really thinking about, what policies could be reflected in not just legislative policies, but organizational policies, school policies, community policies that could potentially be examined, to think about how to better support folks, particularly if they are having trouble meeting these basic needs, if they are, encountering a period of their life where there's really extreme and kind of acute stress, or even if they're living in neighborhoods where things like community violence are really prevalent. What are some of the ways that our policies and our structures can be more supportive so that, again, we're preventing folks from getting to that point of a suicide crisis? Of course, we do talk about other prevention strategies, things like educating community members on identifying potential signs of suicide risk in, their colleagues and their friends and their loved ones, and then knowing how to appropriately navigate folks to the resources that are out there. And again, a lot of that involves boosting awareness of those resources that are out there in the community. So, suicide itself is a complicated health issue, and so prevention is also complex. And it's prevention across kind of, the spectrum of a person's life, and the communities in which they live, work, and play. And so when we think about suicide prevention, it really needs to be kind of that multi-tiered, multi-pronged approach.
One example of this in your new suicide prevention strategies you're working on include collaborative efforts such as the Gun Shop Project. Can you share what this project is and who's involved?
Yeah, the Gun Shop Project is a program that has been implemented in different states across the country. It's a really innovative program that works with federally licensed firearm dealers to provide temporary, voluntary, offsite storage for firearms when someone is in a mental health or suicide crisis. We know from evidence in the literature that creating a safer environment for an individual when they're in this type of crisis can save lives. One of the best things that we can do to prevent suicide is to put time and distance between a person and their means for ending their life. And so the Gun Shop Project really does that by, again, offering this voluntary temporary storage to get that firearm or those firearms out of the home of a person who is struggling so that there's time for that person to receive the services that they need to get beyond this crisis. And so the Gun Shop Project really, again, works with these firearm dealers across Wisconsin to not only sort of provide them education and resources for themselves and their customers, but also, if they're interested, to help support this voluntary offsite temporary storage. A lot of work has been done with this through what's called the Captain John D. Mason program, which is run through the Medical College of Wisconsin in partnership with the Milwaukee VA Medical Center here in Milwaukee. There are other groups across the state that are engaging in this work, including groups up in the Fox Valley, really, again, to sort of continue to populate this map of federally licensed firearm dealers across the state that are willing to provide this great storage option for folks.
You mentioned it's also helpful for suicide prevention within the veteran population, but can this also help serve someone, say a parent, if their child is struggling and they need a place to put their gun in storage?
Absolutely. Absolutely. We talk about safe storage really, really often with parents, and that can certainly involve, storing your firearm in a gun safe that's locked, storing your ammunition separately from the weapon, or, this offsite storage, which is really the safest option for lethal means safety. I hear quite a bit that a perception that, if you have a firearm in the home, it's really about self-protection, and it really is about that self-protection for many people. But if you have children in the home, and particularly children who are experiencing a mental health crisis, it's really, really important to store those firearms safely and out of reach of young people so that, when they're in this crisis and when maybe they're feeling impulsive, they don't have access to that method.
Suicide is often portrayed and has the stigma of being an individual's problem. So how are you working to shift this perspective and help show that community-driven changes like the Gun Shop Project can be more impactful?
Yeah, this is kind of where I tend to get on my soapbox a little bit, is we tend to think about mental health and suicide as like you said, this individual issue, that it's really about, an individual managing their feelings, managing their struggles. But we know that so many of the stressors that individuals face are outside of, maybe their scope of control, maybe involve workplace and community and, even some cultural issues. And so what I like to talk about is it's very important to reach in and provide that environment of support for folks, regardless of whether or not they're having mental health issues. When you are experiencing a mental health or suicide crisis, even getting out of bed is difficult. So the prospect or the idea or the notion of trying to find help on your own, particularly when, the healthcare systems can be very challenging to navigate, is a very, very difficult thing to think about for somebody that's in that space. And so really, I think it's all of our jobs to become what I call expert noticers, noticing when people are, maybe struggling or maybe seem like they're having an off couple of days, and just taking the time to sit down with that person, have a private, non-judgmental conversation, check in and see how they're doing, And then again, knowing what those resources are to navigate folks to if they are in fact in a suicide crisis. But one of the most important things that we can do as loved ones and community members and coworkers is just being that safe person for somebody to talk to and being willing to listen, because it really is about our community. It really is about our culture. It's about our policies and our systems, so much more than it is about the individual. And so we need to be able to wrap around folks to provide that support.
You mentioned earlier about looking at suicide and suicide prevention under a public health lens. Is this a more recent shift in the medical community? Do you think this is part of what's prevented some forward momentum for a while because it is seen as an individual's problem versus this is a public health perspective?
Yeah. When we think about the field of suicidology, kind of historically, it has been very sort of clinically oriented, and suicide has been pretty pathologized, as an individual level medical issue. And certainly, I don't want to take away from the importance of understanding suicide as a biological health issue. It's, chemical, it's genetic. There are biological factors in our brains that certainly can predispose a person to having these different issues throughout their lives. But we know that that's not the whole story. We know that, not everybody who has depression or anxiety or bipolar disorder dies by suicide. And so there has to be more to the story. And that's where the public health perspective really comes in. And like I said, there has been, to your point, a recent shift, I think, in our understanding of suicide. And so we are starting to have these conversations both in the, kind of the traditional mental health and suicidology space and also the public health space, that we can really work together in a transdisciplinary way to be a little bit more creative and innovative about how we move upstream, again, to think about how we can prevent suicide before it becomes a crisis. Because once it becomes that crisis, it becomes more difficult and there becomes more of a potential that, there's going to be more damage that's done in that person's life. So that early identification is a key component of public health and a key component of suicide prevention.
What are some areas in this shift that you're most excited about seeing how they develop or how you implement them in the community?
I'm really excited about policy change because that's kind of where I geek out a little bit is, thinking about the different policy strategies that are available to us as, kind of another tool in our toolbox. I'm also really excited about some recent research that has focused on better understanding not only risk for suicide, but also sort of the expression of suicidal thoughts and behaviors among diverse folks. A lot of our understanding and our conceptualization of suicide is really rooted in kind of a Eurocentric, white, non-Hispanic, and primarily male perspective. And we know that the experience of suicidal thoughts and of mental health challenges in general really differs based on a person's lived experience. And so by better understanding these nuances of again, suicide risk and mental health challenges, we're going to be able to better identify when a person is struggling. If you're simply looking for sadness and hopelessness and feeling like a burden, you're not necessarily going to be able to identify everybody that is maybe struggling. You need to think about other things like aggression, for example, or family discord, or how a culture might think about suicide to really get the broader picture of what we're looking at. And I think as we continue to better understand and then tailor our intervention and prevention strategies accordingly, I think that's what's going to help to move the needle on rates of suicide.
Well, Dr. Kolbeck, thank you so much for joining me to share more about this issue.
Yeah, thank you for having me.
Dr. Sarah Kolbeck is the director of the Division of Suicide Research and Healing in the Comprehensive Injury Center at the Medical College of Wisconsin. She's also an assistant professor of psychiatry and behavioral medicine. She spoke with Lake Effect's Audrey Nowakowski in 2023. On May 5, 1886, Thousands of protesters in Milwaukee were nearing the Bay View rolling mill when the first shots rang out. The protesters were part of the 8-hour movement, seeking better working conditions for laborers in Milwaukee and beyond. State militia had been tasked with guarding the mill. Historian John Gerda explains.
A crowd of roughly 1,200 strikers, largely Polish, gathered at St. Stanislaus Church on 5th and Mitchell, marched down Mitchell Street first and then Kinnickinnick to march on the rolling mill. They found the militia waiting for them, and at a distance of roughly 200 yards, the militia opened fire.
As the smoke faded, the devastation became clear. At least 9 people had been shot. The event became known as the Bay View Massacre. But who were the victims, and where were they buried? That's what listener Brenna Ackert wanted to know. She began her own research into the victims, but wrote to Bubbler Talk after reaching some dead ends.
So I was curious if anyone could find any information, because I certainly couldn't. Sometimes we can find names, but that's usually about it. That's like as far as we could go, at least in my own digging.
But let's take a step back and look at what led to the massacre. The 8-hour movement was born out of the poor working conditions for factory workers in the mid-1800s. Laborers were expected to work 6 days a week for 10 to 12 hours at a time in grueling conditions.
Their goal was an 8-hour day without a cut in pay. So if you're working 12 hours a day for $1.25 a day on the labor side, that's a big deal. So it was a major request. And Milwaukee and Chicago became the epicenters of that movement in the entire country. And the first week of May 1886 was really among the most volatile in Milwaukee's history.
Starting on May 1st, laborers in Milwaukee and Chicago went on strike. Both cities were filled with strikers, united by a common cause. But on May 4th, these protests turned deadly in Chicago when an unknown man threw dynamite into the crowd, killing at least a dozen people. At the same time, tensions were rising in Milwaukee. Wisconsin's Republican Governor Jeremiah Rusk had ordered the National Guard into Milwaukee to quell the protests. As protesters neared the mill, the orders were given.
The captain of the militia said, pick out your man and kill him. And so this was not shooting over their heads to frighten the crowd and have them go back to the south side. No, this was certainly intentional.
According to news reports from the day, the street looked like a battlefield. People lay dying, bleeding. Since 1986, the centennial anniversary of the massacre, the Wisconsin Labor History Society has held a ceremony honoring the dead with 7 beats to represent the 7 victims believed to have died that day. As question asker Brenna Ackert mentions, there are a number of named victims, but the names change depending on the source you're looking at. What remains consistent is the number 7. After a quick, targeted search on Ancestry.com, using the most consistent names listed, I was able to find death certificates for 4 of the named victims: Frank Kunkel, Frank Navarchek, Martin Yankoviak, and Michael Rakolski. These death certificates are very helpful because they include other identifying information, including where they were buried. But that was where my good luck ran out. As I started to search for other names, it became clear this would be a difficult task. John Gerda notes that's kind of how this research goes.
Tedious, granular, and I think the lesson from a lot of this research is that history is messy.
To dig into this mess, I used 3 main resources in the Milwaukee Public Library's Zeidler Room: city directories, historic newspapers, and local history books. I started by trying to find these men in the city directories with mixed results. That's when I headed to the historic newspaper database to find contemporary accounts of what happened that day. But these newspapers, while helpful, are only as reliable as the author, as librarian Heather Smith explains.
You have to understand how information is collected and recorded.
She uses the census as an example.
So if a census worker who's a complete stranger to you comes to your door, they're going to write down what you tell them in their record. So if they get some detail wrong because they perceived that you spoke with an accent and they didn't clearly understand what you said to them, that's what gets put into the census records that we now are using for research decades later.
A few things became clear in reading the accounts from that day. The scene was chaotic, and American journalists weren't great at deciphering Polish names. Some victims I had confirmed through death certificates had entirely wrong names listed in the papers. In one article on the day of the massacre from the Milwaukee Daily Journal, Frank Navarchek was listed as Jacques Narakak. Martin Yankoviak was instead called Marcus Yokoveski. It also included John Marsh among the victims. Now, John Marsh was one of the 3 remaining names that I was searching for, along with Johann Zaska and Robert Erdman. But as the dust settled the following day, there was an updated list in the Daily Journal with the proper names of everyone who had been shot. John Marsh was now John Moshk. John Moshk had a death certificate that confirmed he'd been killed during the massacre. The misspelling of his name wasn't an anomaly, as librarian Heather Smith notes.
All of this stuff was, in many cases, communicated verbally. If things were written down, they were written down in a non-standardized fashion, which is why you'll find variations in spelling in historical records.
In fact, different newspapers would often write names differently. Although he was known as John Moshk in the Daily Journal, he was called Johann Moschke in the Sentinel. Over time, it's likely that John Moshk had been split into 2 separate victims due to the variance in how his name was spelled. Reading through the newspapers of that time shines light on another reality. Many didn't view these protesters as victims, and that's borne out in their death certificates.
The certificate of Michael Ruhalski, the cause of death is listed as shot in a mob. That's editorial. That's saying this is a guy who was kind of out with the rabble. And it was a fairly accurate reflection, I think, of how people in the mainstream kind of thought of the disturbances in that first week of May.
That gets to another reality. Most newspapers seemed more concerned about the threat to public order than they were about the fate of those who had been shot. Updates on the injured sunk lower and lower in the newspapers. Most had stopped covering them entirely, less than a week after the massacre. Instead, the newspapers focused on the criminal trials of those who had led the movement.
Any threat to law and order is met with resistance by the establishment. That's why it's called the establishment. Both the corporate side and the media side as well. So you have a city shut down by strikers who were marching from one employer to another to dramatize their demands. That was clearly a challenge to the status quo.
The majority of protesters were recent immigrants, and not all of them had ties to the community. These were people who could go missing without much notice, making it very difficult to track them down. The massacre had also pitted neighbor against neighbor. The local Kosciuszko guards were among the militiamen who fired on the protesters. They were also Polish immigrants who lived in the same community. While the newspapers lauded the bravery of the militia, many in the Polish community came out against them.
They were boycotted by the people on the South Side, and at the same time, people of Polish background in general were kind of stigmatized as Polanders and drunkards need not apply to jobs. So they were kind of the troublesome workers. But also internally, there was division about, the people who were being shot at and the people who were shooting.
It's unclear what happened to the 4 other victims with serious injuries. But after a lot of research, I can definitively say at least 5 people died. And I know where they're buried. Holy Trinity Cemetery, now part of St. Adelbert Cemetery in Milwaukee's Morgandale neighborhood. With this information in hand, I went to the cemetery with our question asker, Brenna, and told her what I'd found.
You have really tracked down so much information. I'm so glad I reached out to Bubbler Talk to say, hey, take it away from here. Thank you for looking into this. This has been incredible.
We checked in at the cemetery office and asked them to look up records from the 1880s. There wasn't a single record left from 1886. The exact location of the Bay View Massacre victims' graves seemed to have been lost to time. But the people they represented are still there, and their stories still resonate with our world today.
The larger picture is absolutely incontrovertibly correct, where you have an oppressed workforce resisting oppression and the forces of capital clamping down, closing in. That's the story, and we need to keep sight of that and the impact it had on politics later on families certainly. So whether it's 5, whether it's 7, whether it's 9, people died. And they died violent deaths at the hands of their neighbors.
At least 9 people were shot that day in May. Many were severely injured, like Kazimir Dudek, who was shot 4 times in the arm and lost half his jaw. Most victims were laborers whose livelihoods depended on their good health, and those who survived were never the same after that day. But neither was Milwaukee. Although these protests were incredibly controversial, the massacre had helped shift public opinion on labor rights. The sacrifices of the protesters led to better working conditions in the mills and factories, and the rise of a new political party.
It broke the back of the 8-hour movement, but also galvanized those workers to organize politically. So they established a People's Party that swept the next elections, the fall elections. And that was a very important catalyst for the rise of the socialists in Milwaukee.
And maybe learning all of that is worth a bit of digging. For Bubbler Talk, I'm Joy Powers. Did you know you can listen to Lake Effect as a podcast? Search for Lake Effect wherever you get your podcasts to download and listen on demand. Later in the show, we'll talk with a photographer who captures the beauty of the Great Lakes in a new book. But first, we'll look at Milwaukee Magazine's Best of Milwaukee issue, which includes a guide to the best food the city has to offer. That's coming up on Lake Effect on 89.7 WUWM, Milwaukee's NPR. You're listening to Lake Effect on 89.7 WUWM. I'm Joy Powers. Every year, Milwaukee Magazine comes out with a feature highlighting the city's most beloved people and places. The Best of Milwaukee issue features dozens of categories readers vote on, like the best pizza and best Indian restaurant. Chris Drosner is the executive editor of Milwaukee Magazine. He says the magazine's editors also got in on the fun and made their picks for the best custard in the city. Drosner joins Lake Effect's Excret Nunez to talk about this year's list.
There is a lot to dig into in the latest issue of Milwaukee Magazine, but can you start by giving me an overview of what listeners can expect in this year's Best of Milwaukee?
Yeah, this is kind of our signature issue. It's kind of the essence of what we do all year round that is boiled into a single feature that kind of celebrates the greatest things that are happening here in Milwaukee. Every year we start this process pretty early in spring, brainstorming ideas and kind of deciding on the direction. There's a lot of different ways to talk about the great stuff in this city. And we've done a lot of them through the years. You know, sometimes we've leaned more on guest opinions, or we have our Reader's Choice poll. That's always a really central part of it. But how much that's featured kind of varies from year to year. Our editor pick's going to be kind of free form. Like in the last few years, I have kind of thought about Best of Milwaukee as almost like a year in review kind of thing, talking about all the new stuff that, you know, through whatever reason we haven't really been able to cover in the magazine, and kind of having that all in one place. So this year we had a list of ideas that was 7 pages long, which is a lot. So we were able to kind of shape it into what it was, which is, I would say this year we kind of went a little bit more on the Reader's Choice survey, which is, of course, people saying what they think the best new restaurant is or best tacos. But we kind of made that the centerpiece and explored different ways to have fun with the results of that as creative magazine stories.
Yeah, so it seems like a lot of moving parts to putting this really well put together issue together. How is it different from previous years? You know, this is like one of the most, I feel like, anticipated issues every year.
Like last year, we kind of had a your best, our best, and their best parallelism. So we had guest curators who talked about their favorite things. We had our best, which is like our editor's picks for things. And then we had the Reader's Choice survey. So there's kind of these 3 levels. And this year we kind of went further into, like, we wanted to bring our areas of expertise or our unique perspectives sometimes on this topic. So instead of doing like, here's some stuff that we thought was cool this year, it's let's taste test 6 different frozen pizzas, or let's have somebody with fresh eyes or fresh palate, maybe determine what's the best custard in the city, that kind of stuff, which is a little bit different. But, we wanted to kind of bring our unique perspectives or expertise to bear.
Yeah. So let's take a look through the magazine. I feel like my biggest takeaway is how clever and intentional you all were in like playing with readers' choices, how you were mentioning that. So one example I really enjoyed was the full day of activities planned out by the readers' choices, and also this really cool curated list of dining editor Ann Christensen's favorite things to eat using the readers' top choices.
Yeah, one of the pieces was what Ann's pick for a dish was at each of these different restaurant places. So like what to get at room service, which one best new restaurant, what to get at Lake Park Bistro, which one for fine dining, how to kind of be a diner in these different places. And also like there are some disagreements. And for a few of the like cuisine based ones, like we had Mexican, pizza, Indian, vegetarian, and had, I wouldn't necessarily call it disagreements, but like here's my pick for this, which is a way of just kind of adding more stuff to the list. It's subjective which of these things is actually the best. So here's a couple options to try out.
Definitely. And I'm sure that like readers, as they're going through the readers' choices list, I saw the Indian restaurants like you're mentioning. Mine's Tandoor. Didn't even make it to top 3.
Right. Mm-hmm.
Well, one of my favorite sections, you were kind of alluding to it, was ranking like custard places or agreeing to disagree with readers' choices. Like you guys totally didn't shy away from being cheeky.
I mean, when you're taste testing custard, you have to take a stand here. And our culture editor, Evan, is relatively new to Wisconsin. So he had kind of a fresh perspective on this. And he kind of opens the piece saying, like, I feel like people have these like deeply ingrained opinions about custard. And it's like, this is my place. And it's like, well, okay, why is it your place? It's like, oh, I've been going there forever. It's like, okay, well, I can get away from that bias and just evaluate it. And he took it very seriously. He went real hard on this, only doing vanilla custard, which sounds super boring to me, but he thought it was like the clearest expression of like what a good custard is, like you can't hide behind like, moose tracks or whatever. So it's a simple, clear version of a custard, and he evaluated it on creaminess and taste and vanilla flavor and all that stuff. I think one of them, I thought this was funny, that one of his characteristics was how fast or not it melts, which I would not have thought to think about, but that's great. And he came away with a little bit of a zag, I think, when people tend to zig in this town. Leon's and Kopp's are kind of the 2 top favorites probably in the city. And he came away with Gillis's and Wauwatosa being his favorite. So we're not setting out for hot takes here, but we kind of ended up with one, I think, there. I'm a Tosa resident. I enjoy Gillis's. I don't know if I would.
What's your top pick?
Agree. I don't know. I mean, it's custard. It's all good. This is the thing about these taste tests is when you actually get down and start evaluating these things, you kind of want to deconstruct the experience. And it does take away a little bit of the joy of it. I mean, like when you're being critical of something, it's kind of work to do these things. But you for the reader is, of course, like not everything needs to be fun for us, but hopefully it's useful and, kind of helps find the nuances in these things that might be otherwise very similar.
So what you're saying is journalism is really tough work. Well, yeah, you guys also, like you said, tried frozen pizzas, which wasn't like an option for people to vote best of.
Yeah, not everything was necessarily like a direct reflection of the Reader's Choice poll. People eat a lot of frozen pizza, and it's kind of like the custard thing. Like you kind of have your go-to, but there are a lot of them out there. So we taste tested, I think it was 5 different ones that are made in Wisconsin, and came away with some interesting takes. Our favorite was the Screamin' Sicilian Tavern style, which I loved. But it only, like, the rankings were not super high for a lot of the other ones that I eat on a regular basis. So, again, I think it's like paying close attention to the thing that you're doing instead of just kind of the overall experience.
Well, I'm sure categories or winners maybe don't change very often over the years, but I'm wondering if there's like a standout pick for you this year.
Yeah, that's true. The voice of the Reader's Choice tends to be pretty consistent, but we do mix up categories year to year. So in a lot of these categories, especially in food, the food and drink stuff is everybody's favorite categories. We see the volume of votes, and everything. I was pleasantly surprised, I guess, this year that Flower Girl and Flame won pizza. because that is a competitive category. The second and third were Balistreri's and Zaffiro's, which are both like awesome Milwaukee-style pizzerias. There's so many great ones like Y East, Maria's, like on and on and on. And Flower Girl and Flame, which is a relatively new one and has definitely a real positive ethos, was the winner. So it felt like a new era or something within that category. But we try to have some fun with the categories and mix them up a little bit while also being consistent. You know, some other publications that do this have like many more categories. We have something like 63 or 4 or something like that this year. And we mix it up. There's no franchises here. New restaurant obviously is going to be in there every year. Fine dining is usually in there every year. But a lot of the other ones we kind of mix and match to kind of just make an interesting overall package year to year in the poll.
There's a lot of ideas and thought that goes into all of this. Before we wrap up, is there something that stood out to you in this issue in general that you hope readers enjoy too?
I'll say one of my favorite pieces this year was our designer, Bianca Cabral, put together a piece of her. The headline is My Mexican Milwaukee, and she called out a bunch of different places in her old neighborhood of Clark Square, where she grew up and still spends a lot of time. You know, like La Sierrita is her, you know, kind of comfort food go-to. It was really well done, and I thought it really rounded out the whole experience of this is a large and diverse city, and there's not one Milwaukee, there are many Milwaukees. And I was really happy that she put that forward and wrote something that was really excellent.
Absolutely. I mean, this is just a great issue for locals and newbies to read. I know when I moved to Milwaukee, it was my guide to getting to know the city.
That is certainly what we hope it is. We think of Milwaukee Magazine as a guide to getting the most out of Milwaukee and understanding it, and that's kind of our mission. And this is the most distilled version of that mission that we do every year.
Well, Chris, thank you so much for speaking with me today and sharing your team's work with me. I really appreciate it.
Yeah, thanks for having us on.
Chris Strasner is the executive editor of Milwaukee Magazine. He spoke with Lake Effect's Excret Nunez. You can find the Best of Milwaukee feature in this month's issue of Milwaukee Magazine. Coming up next, we'll look at a new book of photography featuring the Great Lakes. That's next on Lake Effect on 89.7 WUWM, Milwaukee's NPR. This is Lake Effect on 89.7 WUWM. I'm Joy Powers. Photographer David Zurich grew up in a small town along Lake Huron, where he spent his formative years on the beach. Zurich left the Midwest to study geography, which led to his career as a photographer, traveling all around the world. Recently, he decided to turn his lens back to the Great Lakes for his new photography book called The Third Coast. It features more than 100 images of the Great Lakes, from unbroken horizons of water and sky to coastal hometowns and remnants of industry. To share what went into this book and the places he captures, Zurich joins Lake Effect's Audrey Nowakowski.
You've traveled a lot as a photographer and studied in Hawaii, and there's a big difference between our personal ocean versus living actually by an ocean. So when did you learn to kind of see the uniqueness of a freshwater Great Lake?
Really, the uniqueness, I guess, came after moving away from the Great Lakes. You know, living so close to a place, it just becomes a part of your everyday existence. And, you know, I always appreciated it, but didn't necessarily dwell on it or think about it too much in sense of uniqueness. It was just part of an ordinary life that I was living. But as I moved away from the Great Lakes and I would go back and visit the Great Lakes, you know, I was always kind of confronted with the scale of the horizon, the scale of those lakes. The spaciousness, I guess, is what I really came to appreciate about those Great Lakes.
Your photography book, The Third Coast, exploring all of America's Great Lakes shoreline, really just highlights that vastness. And as a photographer, you hadn't yet explored the Great Lakes as a subject to work with. So what brought on or inspired this project?
I was in the middle of a project. Actually, much of my work is in Asia, in India, and in the Himalaya region. I was in the middle of a project in India, and COVID and the pandemic shut down international travel. So I live in Kentucky now, and I was kind of spinning my wheels here, thinking what I was going to do, wondering how long this was going to last, as we all were. And then I decided that I would basically make an exploratory trip up to the Great Lakes to see if there was a photography project there. So I went to the hometown, the place where I grew up, and I visited family there and started wandering up along Lake Huron, with my camera, making images. And slowly it dawned on me that this would be a great project, and it turned out to be a wonderful project. So really, it's the COVID and the pandemic shutting down international travel that was a specific trigger for this particular project.
And this book is divided by seasons, and each season kind of focuses on a different Great Lake. So can you share a bit more about the logistics of how you planned out your photography road trip, essentially?
Yeah, absolutely. All of my work really represents, I guess, excuses to go have adventures. And, one of the things about this particular project is I came away realizing that I had just as big an adventure along the Great Lakes as I've had in any other place in the world. And that was a wonderful realization towards the end. But at the beginning, I hadn't really thought to compartmentalize things by even lakes or seasons. I went up to Lake Huron and I was traveling along the Thumb area, which is a very familiar ground for me. It's kind of home ground for me, and starting to make images. That was in the fall. Fall has this kind of melancholy atmosphere to it. And a lot of memories were coming up as I was recalling my youth, traveling with my family along the lake. My folks were all up from the Thumb area. That's where they came from. So we'd go up and visit family up there. And so there started to kind of develop in my mind a sense that I could distribute my work across the lakes by season. And when I started thinking in those terms, how I would line up a lake with a season, Lake Huron was the first one that happened to just be coincidentally the autumn when I was up there. But then I was thinking, okay, Lake Superior, it had to be winter, so that really kicked it off. And I went up to Lake Superior in the winter months and photographed up there, and then things kind of lined up after that.
And the images in your book go beyond simply lakeshore scenes, right? There's also photos on land, kind of speaking to the interplay of lakes and the agriculture or other human elements and industries around them, a lot of seasonal aspects, of course. What in particular would meet your criteria if it was a scene not immediately by a lake? What captured your attention that wasn't a body of water?
All of the images in this book are all made on the lakeshore or within a couple of miles of the lakeshore. So there's going to be some spatial interaction, some geographic connection between that landscape and the lake. Oftentimes, though, what is interesting is as you drive through the countryside, at least for me as I experienced it, driving through the countryside just a couple of miles from the lake in farm country. And again, my family grew up as dairy farmers up on the Thumb. My mother, for example, had very little interaction with the lake, even though it was a couple of miles away. And the same is true with my father. I mean, they were busy on the farm. My dad didn't even learn how to swim, for example, even though he lived a couple of miles away from it. So I guess in a way, partly it was the linkage between what was going on a couple of miles from the lake and the lake itself. And partly it was a realization that there was a bit of a disconnection here, even though geographically these were really in the same spot, the same corridor, a couple of miles apart. But there was really a spatial distancing between people's lives in the interior. So in that way, I wasn't trying to purposely make connections between an interior image and the lakeshore. They just kind of fell in line as I was pursuing these lakeshore routes that I was traveling on.
Yeah, I'd like to talk about a few photos highlighting industries built along the lakes, starting with the photo of the iron ore dock on Marquette Bay. Can you describe that picture?
Yeah. And again, some of these, the one you mentioned, for example, is a perfect example, but some of these have very, very direct linkages. So the iron ore dock, this is the iron ore that's mined in the interior of the Upper Peninsula of Michigan in this particular case. and it's shipped then to the docks and loaded onto freighters and then, basically shipped around the world. So this was a winter shot. This is the old dock. They've got actually a new infrastructure there to handle some of this kind of big work now. But I was wandering around Marquette Bay and I saw that dock from various perspectives. It wasn't really until I started walking towards it that I saw the geometry. So I guess what drew me to that image, or at least making that image, was really the geometry involved. And then there was a small, tiny little window-like opening at the end of that dock that looked out onto the vastness of the lake, a tiny little thing that you're looking through. So that was what was of interest to me, I guess. It was a geometric kind of compositional thing.
Yeah, a lot of these images just fall into place so nicely. And I think another example of that that's not centered around water is the photo of Hiawatha National Forest.
Yes. So Hiawatha National, this was actually very, very close to the lake. Again, I was on a hiking trail, but I had snowshoes on. So I was snowshoeing through the forest, and partly the link between that forest and the lake was really lake effect, given the name of your program here. That snowfall that we find so heavy along that lake shore that's coming from the moisture from the lake itself is just dumping on this forest. Partly with this image, it was just the quietude of that place. I mean, it was so quiet. The snow on the ground was muffling all the sounds. You just had the flurries dropping down through these trees. And I was trying to quietly walk through it, I guess, and be there quietly. So that's the quiet of that image is what was most compelling for me.
While you capture a lot of beauty, certainly, you also captured challenges that face the Great Lakes regions, such as algae blooms, there's agricultural runoff, or abandoned houses, abandoned businesses. Why was it important to show both sides of this?
This is a great question. It really gets at the heart of my work. I don't do a lot of nature photography. I don't take a lot of what I would think of as kind of the classic pretty picture. I'm really interested in photographing places that connect in a certain way to human society. That includes how we have transformed places. So I'm really looking at the landscape from a cultural landscape point of view, not a natural landscape point of view. And even more than that, I'm looking at the landscape as kind of a reflective surface, a mirror, if you will, of the lives of people who live in that place. And so, we imprint ourselves in these places where we live, and some of it is intentional and some of it is unintentional, but it is still reflective of who we are as individuals and as a society. So that really gets at the crux of the photography that I enjoy doing, is to have the landscape be a palette, not in terms of natural processes, such as a natural landscape photographer might do, the beauty of a place that's rendered by natural processes, but a place that is rendered by human and societal processes. And this doesn't always end up being a beautiful place. It's always an interesting place. And with the right kind of composition and light, it can have its own form of beauty, but not in a picturesque way, I guess I would say.
So if someone's paging through this for the first time, they're not from the Great Lake region, what do you want people to take away and know and appreciate about our third coast?
One of the things would be the diversity of it. A lot of folks, being in Milwaukee, and I'm from a hometown in Lake Huron, we take a lot of this for granted. So one kind of audience would be the people who live in the Great Lakes region, who really interact with these lakes on a personal basis frequently, maybe even on a daily basis, but seeing them perhaps in a little bit different way through my eyes. I mean, as a photographer and as an artist, I have my own vision and image, which is different than anybody else's, but it's an opportunity to see a place through another person's eyes, which can be illuminating. For folks who aren't from the Great Lakes region and who may have very little knowledge about these lakes, yes, they're beautiful places. Yes, they're large places, but they're incredibly diverse places, and they're important on so many levels in terms of the resources they provide, certainly water, but other kinds of natural resources, in terms of their recreational potential for people. So it's really getting at these lakes as a geographic component of the larger American landscape. And it's a place that a lot of folks, frankly, in the United States aren't that familiar with, even though they've heard the name before.
Well, we certainly are fortunate to be so near a third coast ourselves. And David, I want to thank you so much for telling me more about your photography, exploring all the lakes beyond Lake Michigan.
Well, I appreciate it very much. It's been a pleasure talking with you. And yeah, I'm a big fan of the Great Lakes.
Sweet Mother Michigan, Father Superior, coming down from Mackinac and Sault Ste. Marie.
David Zurich is a photographer, and his new book is called The Third Coast, America's Great Lakes Shoreline. He spoke with Lake Effect's Audrey Nowakowski. You can check out some of the photos discussed at WUWM.com. And that wraps up today's show. I'm Joy Powers. If you missed any of Lake Effect this week, you can find all of our conversations at WUWM.com. If you'd like to take the show on the go, you can download the Lake Effect podcast wherever you get your podcasts. Tomorrow on Lake Effect, we'll learn about a project aimed at preventing future flooding in Milwaukee. Plus, in a new Chirp Chat, we'll learn about chimney swifts and the tornado-like dance these birds do in the sky. Thanks so much for joining us right here on listener-supported 89.7 WUWM, Milwaukee's NPR.
Singing Sweet Mother Michigan, Father Superior, coming down from Mackinac and Sault Ste. Marie. Blue water Huron rolls down to Lake Erie, falls into Ontario and runs on out to sea. Singing Sweet Mother Michigan, Father